Tonight, we journey through the quiet halls of a cathedral that sings without a choir, where every shadow, every stone, and every ray of light holds a memory. Let the calm of this sacred space guide you gently into rest. You remember the meadow before it was a meadow, a place where the grass leaned in the same direction every afternoon as though listening to something far away. The air thick with the smell of time and distant rain. The soil soft under your boots because no road had ever crossed it. Only the footsteps of shepherds moving slowly through centuries of seasons. You remember how the land carried its silence easily, a quiet so deep that even birdsong seemed hesitant, as though the world was waiting for something larger than wind or wings. Something with a weight of its own, like a hand about to lower itself gently onto a drumskin. The first time you walked there at dusk, when the evening light slid down through the clouds like candle wax melting in the sky, you felt the air gather around you in long, patient breaths, and you wondered why a place so empty could feel so watched. The workers came in the season when the earth smelled of wet hay, carrying carts of stone that groaned like tired oxen. Men with faces browned by wind and firelight, their hands calloused enough to carry centuries inside their skin, voices low so as not to disturb whatever slept beneath the soil. They began with a circle marked by ash and rope, the edges traced slowly by boots and whispers, as if afraid that a single loud sound might wake the earth too soon, their gestures deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though the stones would only stay if asked gently. Each block was cut in the far quarry where the wind never stopped moving, and you can still smell the dust rising from the chisel strikes, the metallic bite of iron on limestone, the faint scent of pine where the ropes were tied around sledges, the mingled sweat of men who spoke little because the work itself filled the air like a kind of prayer. You remember the day the first stone was set down, the way the ground seemed to accept its weight with a sigh, the mason kneeling beside it as if placing a child into sleep, his hand flat on the pale surface as though listening for a heartbeat. The sun slid behind the hills as the last hammer fell silent, and for a moment the whole meadow seemed to hold its breath, the shadows deepening around that single stone until it looked like the beginning of something that had always been waiting here, as though the land itself had whispered the idea into someone's dream long before. Night came slowly, carrying the smell of cooling grass and river water. The first stars spilling across the darkening sky like grains of salt over black wood. And the men sat around their fire eating bread and cheese, speaking in low voices that cracked like twigs. The stone behind them already sinking into memory as if it had been here for centuries rather than hours. The fire threw their shadows high across the meadow, and you can still see how the smoke climbed into the windless air, twisting itself into threads that seemed to reach toward the stars like long fingers, asking for something the earth could not give. When the workers slept, the night folded itself around the meadow with the kind of darkness that feels soft rather than empty, the kind that holds crickets and the smell of ash and the faint warmth of breath rising from blankets where men dreamed with tired bodies curled like question marks beneath the sky. You remember walking to the first stone when no one else was awake, feeling the coolness of the grass brush your boots, the faint silver of moonlight pooling in the low places, where dew had already begun to gather like thoughts too heavy to rise. The stone was cold beneath your hand, smoother than you expected, as though the rain of another age had already washed it clean, and for a moment you felt certain the earth was listening through it, the way a conch shell carries the sea, even when far from water. Morning returned slowly, the hills paling first, then the long threads of mist loosening themselves from the river like scarves falling from tired shoulders, until the sky lifted itself into that pale blue silence that only comes after nights without wind. The men rose one by one, stretching their arms like trees, testing their branches, bread breaking in their hands with the faint crackle of old wood. Faces washed in the river where the water carried the taste of tin and autumn leaves, and the first smoke of breakfast fires drifted sideways across the grass. They added more stones before noon. Each one carried on wooden sledges that groaned like sleepers, turning in a dream. The ropes creaking, the dust rising, and always that slow, careful setting into place, as though they feared the ground might refuse them if they worked too quickly. By the week's end, the circle of stones had grown high enough to cast its own shadows, and you remember the strange feeling that the meadow no longer belonged to itself, that the grass and sky and soil had already begun to bend inward toward this new weight, like people bowing before a procession. At night, the walls held the firelight as though tasting it, the stone glowing faintly while men leaned back on blankets with their heads propped on saddlebags, the air thick with wood smoke and the sweet, burnt smell of spilled wine soaking into the ground near their cups. You remember lying awake long after the others slept, the stars pulling themselves slowly across the roofless walls, the fire dwindling into a red hush, and in the distance an owl called once, low and questioning, as though surprised to find such things here where grass had always been king. The seasons turned while the walls climbed, each day bringing the smell of lime and sweat and sawdust, the songs of workers drifting across the fields in the afternoon like nets cast over water, voices rough but steady, as though the rhythm of the work itself shaped the music. Spring brought the sharp, green scent of rain in the grass, the sky sometimes opening so suddenly that men worked shirtless, while steam lifted from the stones like breath from animals, and the ground grew soft enough that cartwheels sank deep, making roads where none had been. Summer baked the walls until the limestone shone white as old bone, the air full of bees and the salt of men's backs and the slow, patient cracking of wood left too long in the sun. Hammers ringing until evening cooled everything with the smell of river water sliding under the bridge beams. Autumn came with its smoke and apples, with leaves plastered damp against the half-built walls, men warming their hands before fires that smelled of pine pitch, the early frosts silvering the meadow each dawn until the stone foundations shone pale as moonlight before the sun cleared them again. Even in winter they built, breath rising like incense from their mouths, gloves stiff with ice, sledges groaning through snow that squealed under boots, walls lifting themselves steadily against skies the color of pewter, the smell of fires and wet wool filling the evenings when the men crowded together in huts at the edge of the site. Years passed like this, slow as roots thickening under soil, the meadow shrinking behind walls and towers, until one day you walked beneath the half-built arches and felt the wind change its voice, as though the air had begun rehearsing something through those stone ribs. You stood where the altar would be and looked upward through scaffolds and dust motes, sunlight falling in pale ladders, and you thought the whole place felt like a lung filling slowly with breath, as though waiting for a song you could almost hear but not yet name. When the first roof beam was raised, the workers cheered softly, hats waving in the dusk. But you noticed how even their joy carried a hush beneath it, the way footsteps sound in snow. As though everyone sensed the building wanted quiet more than celebration. You can still smell that evening, if you try, the sawdust sharp as pepper, the smoke heavy with pine resin, the air cooling fast so that men wrapped scarves around their throats, voices drifting low as the first stars climbed into the rafters like silver birds coming home. The walls were only half the height they would one day reach, the roof a skeleton against the moon. Yet already the place felt older than its builders, as though time itself had paused here to watch the stone grow upward out of grass and wind. Long before any choir came, long before bells or candles or painted glass, you remember standing among the scaffolds with your hand on the first stone, feeling the weight of everything that would come after press softly against your palm like the faintest beginning of music. You remember the man who came walking across the meadow one early autumn morning when the grass still held the night's rain in silver beads, his cloak carrying the smell of long roads and wood smoke, his eyes already tracing shapes in the air, as if the sky itself had asked him to come. He was not young, but walked like someone who never felt the weight of years, his steps quiet on the soft earth, his face thin yet marked with the kind of calm that belongs to men who spend more time listening than speaking. And you could tell at once he had the patience of stone. The workers watched him curiously as he moved among the half-built walls, running his fingers along the mortar lines still drying in the sun, leaning close as though the stones might answer him, his eyes half closed the way some people listen to distant bells carried over water. He stood in the middle of the unfinished nave where scaffolds rose like bare trees and stayed so still you could hear the wind threading itself through the gaps. His head tilted slightly, as though the air itself was trying to tell him where the walls wanted to go. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost hesitant, like a man careful not to wake someone. And he said the cathedral must rise in such a way that the wind could move through it without ever feeling trapped, because music only lives where air can breathe. You remember how he spent days walking the site with a stick of chalk, drawing lines on the earth while the workers carried stones around him, the air thick with the smell of dust and horse sweat, his face tilted always toward the wind, as though reading something written in its currents. At dusk, he would climb the low ridge beyond the meadow, boots sinking into the wet grass, and stand there while the light faded, watching how the evening breeze turned the river into silver threads and the half-built walls into long, trembling silhouettes. Sometimes he would sit cross-legged in the grass until stars filled the sky, unrolling sheets of parchment weighted with stones at the corners, sketching arches and towers while moths fluttered against his lantern, the smell of ink and warm oil drifting around him like a faint promise of rain. The villagers began to say he was building not a church but an instrument, that the towers would be its pipes and the open windows its strings, because he spoke often of how the wind must be able to pass through without losing its voice. You can still see him testing the air by releasing handfuls of dry grass from the half-built walls, watching how each stalk turned and fell, eyes following the invisible paths through which future music might one day wander when no one was here to guide it. The workers teased him at first, calling him the man who built for ghosts. But even they grew quiet after a while, because there was something in the way he listened to empty space that made you feel as though silence itself were speaking through him. He rarely raised his voice, but always knew when the stones were set wrong, pausing the work with a lift of his hand, his eyes narrowing not in anger, but as if trying to hear how the air caught between the blocks, then nodding when it sounded right again. At night he slept little, choosing instead to walk the scaffolds by lantern light, his shadow long across the half-made arches, pausing often with his hands on the rough stone, as though feeling the pulse of something growing slowly beneath his fingertips. You remember one evening when he asked everyone to stand still, the masons with their hammers resting on shoulders, the carters leaning on their mules, even the children who carried water pausing mid-step, and for a long minute the whole meadow held its breath with him. The wind came through the gaps in the walls like someone crossing a flute, low and trembling at first, then rising softly until it seemed the air itself was singing a single wavering note, and the architect closed his eyes as though hearing an old friend speak. After that day the men worked with a kind of reverence, as though they too had heard something not meant for words, their voices dropping lower near the walls, their songs in the evenings carrying a gentler rhythm when the fires burned along the edges of the site. The architect spoke often of light as well as wind, saying the sun must be allowed to fall through colored glass like rain through leaves, that the walls should hold darkness the way hands hold water, not trapping it but shaping it before letting it go. He walked through the half-finished aisles at dawn when the mist drifted like smoke from wet fires, measuring where the first light touched stone, his breath rising pale in the cold. The sound of distant roosters carrying thinly across the waking fields. When he began designing the towers, he spent whole afternoons watching birds wheel above the meadow, sketching the way they tilted their wings into the wind, saying the spires must break the air gently, like feathers parting a river, so that music could slip around them unharmed. The villagers sometimes brought him bread and wine at midday, leaving baskets near his sketches, when he was too lost in thought to notice, and he would nod absently without looking up, as though the walls themselves were speaking louder than any human kindness could. Children followed him often, carrying his tools or running ahead to scare crows from the scaffolds, and he let them climb the lower walls while he worked, their laughter mixing with the ring of chisels and the slow rumble of carts bringing stone from the quarry. You remember how he never hurried the work, saying a building made too quickly would never learn to breathe properly, that each stone must forget the weight of the road before being asked to carry the weight of heaven. The men grumbled about his slowness during the cold months when their breath turned white and fingers stiffened around hammers. But even then they obeyed him, because somehow the half-built walls already felt older than any of them, as if time itself listened to his instructions. Sometimes at sunset he would climb the tallest scaffold and stand there long after the others left, his cloak snapping softly in the wind, the sky behind him burning down into orange coals, the shadows of the rising towers stretching across the meadow like fingers reaching for night. You can still smell the evenings when he worked alone, the sawdust sharp in the cooling air, the lantern oil sweet and smoky, the distant river carrying the sound of frogs, beginning their slow music under the willows while he bent over his parchments with ink-stained hands. Winter came again with its frozen breath crawling through the half-made windows, snow whitening the scaffolds until the whole place looked carved from a single block of ice. And still he walked the walls each morning, listening to how the wind changed its song through the empty arches. He said once, almost to himself, that a cathedral should feel like a held note rather than a building. And you understood then why he spent so long arranging towers and windows as though tuning strings stretched across the air itself. By the time spring loosened the river ice and softened the earth around the foundations, the plans for the towers and roof lay finished in his hut, parchment corners curling in the damp, each line drawn with the care of someone writing music rather than stone measurements. The day he left for the quarry to choose the final stones, the walls already rose high enough to swallow the sound of footsteps, and when the wind moved through them, it carried not the roar of storms, but something closer to breath, the low murmur of air shaping itself into song. You remember watching him cross the meadow one last time that evening, the sun falling behind the towers like embers sliding into ash, his figure growing small against the long grass, the plans under his arm curling slightly in the wind as though already alive with music. Even now, when the night turns quiet enough, you feel certain the air above those walls still carries the memory of his listening, as if the whole place had learned its song from the silence he left behind. The day the bells were first hung high in the half-finished tower, the ropes still smelling of hemp and river water, the metal dark with the dust of the forge, the workers stepping back as though they had placed hearts into a giant ribcage. The air was damp with early spring rain, drops sliding down the pale stone like beads of sweat, and when the first bell struck under the mason's hand, the sound rolled across the valley with the weight of thunder softened by distance. It was said the choir would come by midsummer, voices trained in the monastery's aperver, their hymns rising like smoke through the new windows of colored glass. Yet the days unfolded, one after another, in silence, the bells gathering dust beneath swallows' nests. You remember how the villagers waited each week, sitting on the low walls as the evenings cooled, watching the road where no singers came, the sky turning violet above the towers, while the unfinished roof swallowed the last gold of daylight. The masons worked steadily through those months, their hammers clicking like insects in tall grass, while the architect, older now and bent more often over his drawings, kept looking toward the empty road as though expecting voices to arrive with the next wagon load of timber. By harvest time, the windows blazed with saints and vines and the colors of autumn leaves. Yet still the air inside the cathedral carried only the smell of mortar, dust, and rain-soaked wool, never the warmth of human song. You remember how the villagers began to murmur about the silence, wondering if the promised choir had lost its way among the flooded roads, or if the abbots had changed their minds and sent the singers to some richer city downstream. Winter came with its long breath of frost sliding under the half-set doors, the rafters swelling and groaning in the cold nights, wind moving through the open arches with the voice of someone wandering without purpose, low and restless, yet never entirely lonely. The architect grew ill that season, coughing by the fires in his hut where the smell of pine resin filled the dark like a stubborn memory of summer, his hands too weak to hold the compass steady over his parchment plans. You remember visiting him one evening when snow glazed the meadows under a round, expressionless moon, the sky pale as bone, the air so still that every door hinge and bucket handle in the village seemed frozen into silence. He said the choir might never come, his voice thin as candle smoke, yet he kept speaking of the wind through the windows, as if it carried music the world had simply failed to notice, like a melody heard only in dreams. When he died before spring thawed the river, the bells rang themselves at dusk though no one climbed the tower. Ropes swaying in a wind that smelled faintly of thawing earth, and the first wet shoots pushing through the snow-softened ground. The villagers said the architect's spirit had asked the air to sing for him, that the wind knew the notes he had drawn in silence on his parchments, though no one spoke loudly about it, because the sound of those bells carried something both tender and unsettled. By summer, the walls stood finished beneath a roof, darkened by tar and rain, the floor paved in stone so smooth it held the chill even at noon. Yet the choir loft waited with its railings polished and empty, the air above it bright with dust. You remember climbing those narrow stairs one evening, your hand sliding along the cold wood, the smell of pigeons nesting in the rafters, sharp above the sweetness of candle wax rising from below, where the villagers lit tapers for the architect's soul. From the loft you could see the whole nave swimming in shadows, the windows glowing faintly with sunset, the air gathering in soft folds beneath the arches, as though waiting for someone to shake it into music, like a rug holding dust. The first priest arrived late that autumn, a thin man with a leather satchel smelling of salt and mildew, his face weathered by river wind, his eyes tired, as though he had listened to too many prayers carried through smoke-thick rooms. He blessed the walls with water that froze on the stone sills, spoke Latin words the villagers repeated without understanding, then left again down the winter road, promising to send a choir once the abbey had trained new voices. Years passed while the bells gathered rust at their edges, while swallows nested in the tower louvres, while the villagers brought bread and grain to the altar steps, though no hymn ever lifted through the arches, except the low wind threading itself along the floor. You remember one spring when a traveling musician left his fiddle on the altar overnight after playing in the village square, and in the morning the strings were humming faintly, though no hand touched them, the sound thin as breath against glass. The villagers said it was only the wind slipping through a crack in the shutters. Yet the note carried a sweetness that made even the priest stop sweeping ash from the floor. His broom held motionless, as though the air had turned to water around him. Sometimes, in late autumn, when fog swallowed the meadows, you would hear something drifting through the half-dark. Not voices exactly, not the full shape of a hymn, but the rise and fall of sound as though someone tuned invisible instruments behind the walls. The farmers swore the wind changed when it passed through the towers, gathering warmth even in January, carrying music none could name, yet all recognized in the way one recognizes a childhood face seen only once in a dream. One evening you stood alone in the nave after the candles had guttered out, the darkness thick as fur along the benches, and you heard a tone so low and steady it seemed carved from the same stone as the pillars themselves. It lasted only a moment, fading into the hollow hush beneath the roof, yet it left the air trembling softly, as if the building itself had taken a breath and held it, waiting for something neither wind nor man could provide. The villagers said perhaps the choir was never meant to come, that the building wanted its own music rather than the borrowed voices of men. Music made from wind and rafters and bells, rung only by storms. You remember thinking the architect might have known this all along, might have drawn his plans to catch not the songs of monks, but the restless breath of sky moving through stone, the way water moves through reeds to make its long, low flutes of winter sound. Even now, when you walk there on cold mornings, you hear the faintest threads of tone weaving through the arches, softer than bees in clover. steadier than snow on roof tiles, as if the building still waits for the choir, yet sings without it all the same. The evening, because the air had that strange stillness which comes before rain. The clouds low and bruised above the hills, the light dimming not with the gentle grace of sunset, but as if someone were slowly closing a door between earth and sky. The meadow grass leaned without wind, as though holding its breath, the river moving in silence, thick as oil. The first drops falling heavy enough to darken the dust where cartwheels had passed hours before, leaving the whole valley smelling of wet earth and iron. You stood beneath the half-finished tower as the first thunder rolled, slow and far away, a sound with no hurry in it, only wait, like someone turning over in a dream so deep the world itself seemed reluctant to wake. The bells above you, dark with rain, swayed slightly in the gathering wind, though no ropes moved, and you remember thinking how they looked like sleeping heads shifting in their rest, dreaming of some music not yet meant for ears. The workers had gone before the sky broke open, their lanterns swinging along the road toward the village, voices carrying faintly over the distance like threads unspooling, leaving you alone with the stones cooling under the first hard breath of the storm. Rain came in sheets so thick the world beyond the walls disappeared, the fields vanishing behind curtains of water, the torches outside sputtering into smoke, the air smelling of pine pitch and soaked linen from the priest's laundry left too long on the lines. You remember sheltering near the altar where the roof already held against the sky. The darkness broken by lightning so white and sudden it made the saints in the windows glow like ghosts for a single heartbeat before vanishing back into shadow. The wind moved through the open arches in long moans, gathering in the half-finished lofts like water in a basin, until the whole building seemed to breathe with the slow, uneasy rhythm of a sleeper turning against the weight of a dream. Then the bells began to ring, not with the wildness of ropes pulled by hurried hands, but with slow, measured strikes, each tone swelling until it filled the nave and spilled out into the storm-heavy fields beyond the doors. You remember the first note trembling the rafters above you, the second rolling through the floor under your boots, the sound neither joyful nor warning but something older, like the voice of the hills calling through the body of the building itself. No one else was there to hear it except the sparrows huddled under the eaves, their feathers slick with rain. Yet the bells kept sounding, one after another, the wind pulling each tongue against its bronze with a steadiness no human rhythm could hold. The storm did not rage, but pressed in slow, heavy breaths against the walls, the rain softening after a while into long threads that gleamed in the torchlight along the doorframe, the air thick with the smell of wet stone and charred wick. You remember climbing the narrow stair toward the tower, the wooden steps slick beneath your hands, the air warmer the higher you went, as though the bells themselves carried a heat left by centuries of silence, breaking all at once into sound. At the top, the wind met you with open hands, the ropes thrashing against the floor, though no one held them, the bells above swinging just enough to call their voices into the night, where the valley answered only with the hush of rain on leaves. Lightning showed the meadow silver for an instant, the grass bowing under water, the road a ribbon of black glass, the village lights trembling in the distance, as though the storm had set even the hearth fires flickering with its slow pulse. You leaned against the stone lip of the tower, rain soaking your sleeves, and felt the vibration of each toll humming through the wall into your ribs, the sound turning the whole building into an instrument the wind alone had chosen to play. It lasted long enough for you to lose count of the strikes, the notes rising into the dark, where thunder rolled back like an answer spoken in a language too deep for anyone to learn, fading always slower than it began. Then the bells grew, still one by one, their last echoes folding themselves into the wet air until only the rain remained. Soft again now, whispering along the roof tiles as though nothing had happened, as though the night had dreamed the whole thing. You remember standing there in the tower, long after the silence returned, your breath clouding the air, the ropes dripping beside you, like the manes of tired horses, the bells dark and motionless against the faint glow of the clouds. When the wind shifted, it carried the smell of river mud and struck matches from the village where someone lit lamps again. The storm already wandering toward the eastern hills with its pockets empty of thunder, leaving only wet fields steaming under the night. The road back to your lodging shone like polished slate under the moon that finally pushed through the thinning clouds. Your boots loud in the new stillness where frogs had already begun calling from the ditches, as if nothing had disturbed their evening. The villagers asked the next morning if you had heard it, voices low over bread and smoke, while the priest frowned into his cup, saying bells could not ring without hands because bronze had no will and wind carried no intention. Yet the workers walked softer around the cathedral that day, their hammers quieter, as though the building had spoken in the only language it knew, and they were reluctant to interrupt whatever it might still be trying to say. You remember the smell of sun-warmed stone rising as the walls dried through the afternoon, the bells above holding their silence with the calm of creatures sated after singing, the ropes coiled neatly, though no one admitted to touching them. For weeks afterward, the village children would run to the tower on windy nights, waiting for the notes to return, yet the bells never moved again except under the pull of human hands on feast days and funerals. Still, on evenings, when the clouds gather thick as wool along the hills and the air grows heavy with the taste of rain, the villagers glance toward the tower as though expecting the old music to rise once more out of empty wind. Even now, when storms walk the valley with their black shoulders brushing the hills, you feel certain the building waits for some breath older than weather to find its ropes again, to draw that low, patient voice back through the hollow body of stone. And though the bells hang silent through seasons of frost and wheat and thawing earth, you sometimes imagine the wind rehearsing among the rafters, preparing some slow hymn the world will only hear when no one stands below to listen. The first evening it happened because the light outside was already failing, the sky fading from blue to iron, as though someone had drawn a long brush of soot across its width, leaving only a thin seam of brightness above the hills. The air carried the smell of wood smoke from the village where doors were being closed against the night, shutters drawn with soft clatters, dogs settling in straw with the slow movements of creatures that knew the dark by heart. Inside the cathedral, the stones were cooling beneath your hands as you moved between the unfinished pillars, the last warmth of the day escaping like breath from an animal already falling asleep beneath the weight of its own silence. The candles had been lit before vespers, their flames soft and steady in the wide nave where the wind rarely reached, the wicks leaning only slightly, as though listening for footsteps that never came once the prayers were finished. You had stayed behind after the priest left, his robe trailing dust along the aisle, his lantern swinging faintly as he crossed into the night, leaving the air inside thick with incense that clung like the scent of rain on stone. One by one, the candles should have gone out as the hours passed, their flames drawing closer to the wax-smoothed rims. But you remember how each wick seemed to catch the darkness and hold it away, as though the night had no claim here. The windows grew black with the falling dusk, the saints turning into shadows behind the colored glass, yet the small flames burned on gold against the slow weight of evening that pressed its damp fingers along the walls and floors. You leaned near one candle where the wax had run like frozen rivers along the stand, the flame steady as a held breath, though the air in the cathedral had cooled enough for you to see your own exhalations rising faintly. Hours passed with the wind moving outside in long, low sighs, clouds scudding across the moon, yet the candles neither shortened nor faltered, their light soft as if painted rather than burning, as though the night itself had agreed to leave them untouched. You walked the aisles slowly, your footsteps echoing like water dripping in a cave, the smell of hot wax mingling with the old scent of hymns sung long ago, when the plaster was still fresh and the wood bright beneath varnish. The floor beneath your boots felt cool and faintly damp from the day's storm, yet the flames made the air above each candle warm enough for your fingers to feel the difference. A circle of small summer holding against the autumn chill. Somewhere in the rafters a bird moved in its sleep, claws scratching lightly along a beam, but even that faint sound seemed unwilling to disturb the gold-lit stillness pooling in the corners where the shadows gathered like folded cloth. You thought perhaps a trick of draft or resin in the wax might explain it. But the longer you watched, the less the flames resembled anything earthly, each wick upright, each tongue of fire neither leaning nor shrinking, though hours softened the night outside. The bells did not ring that evening, no wind prowled the arches, yet the candles stood against the slow dark like sentries that had forgotten the difference between night and day, their patience wider than the hours they quietly consumed. You remember touching the rim of one holder where the metal had grown warm, though the wax beneath it lay smooth and unmelting, the light steady enough to cast the bones of your fingers in sharp gold against the wall. The smell of wax and smoke should have thickened as time passed, yet the air remained clear as river wind, the flames giving no more than their glow, as though the burning existed without cost, like a voice humming without breath behind it. When the priest returned before dawn, he found you seated near the altar, the candles still bright around you, though their wicks had burned since vespers, his face folding into quiet surprise, as though the night itself had disobeyed him somehow. He said nothing while unlocking the side door for the first parishioners, their boots ringing on the stones, their eyes catching on the unspent candles that had burned the whole night, yet looked as though they had just been lit. Some crossed themselves, some only whispered that perhaps the wind had held its breath, yet no one could name a reason why the flames had lasted longer than the oil lamps outside, which had guttered hours before along the village road. For many evenings after that, the candles were watched as closely as the sky for signs of weather, some expecting them to falter again, others half afraid they might burn forever and turn the cathedral into a place where time refused to pass. Yet night after night they burned until morning with the same calm. their wax pooling but never diminishing. The air around them always warm, though the rest of the building lay cold enough to mist your breath before the sun rose. You remember touching the walls one dawn after the candles were finally snuffed by the priest's hand. The stones cool again, the air thin with the faint scent of smoke, as though the building itself had drawn one long sigh at last. It became a quiet custom after that for villagers to leave letters near the stands before evening. Words folded small and set beside the wax, as though whatever kept the flames alive might read them in the hours before dawn. The children watched the candles most of all, their eyes wide when the night wind slipped through the open arches, yet left every flame steady, as if the fire belonged to something deeper than weather or air or even the wick itself. On some mornings, when fog lay low across the valley, the priest would find the letters damp, but the candles untouched. Their wicks blackened from snuffing, but never from any wind or rain that might have slipped through the windows in the night. You sometimes think of those nights when the whole building glowed with small fires that refused to fade, the air thick with gold warmth, while the world outside lay cold and starless, the hills waiting under clouds like folded animals. And though the candles no longer burn past their hours, though the wax now melts as any flame must, you cannot stand in that nave after dusk without glancing toward the stands, half expecting to see them waiting again for the night to begin. Because somewhere in the long hush between bells and wind and the slow breathing of the valley, you still imagine a single flame that might refuse the dark, its small gold voice holding back the hours with nothing but its light. You remember how the windows always held their colors in the daytime, their saints and angels painted in long reds and blues across the nave. Yet by night they should have fallen into darkness, like everything else in the valley. The glass had been brought from far cities centuries before, carried on carts through rivers and snow, each panel set into place by hands whose names the wind had long forgotten. So only the images remained, while the makers lay beneath grass and moss. By day the sun poured through them like warm honey spilling across the stone floor, the faces of prophets and martyrs catching light that felt almost human against the chill walls, the air bright with color drifting like leaves across water. But the night you remember most clearly was one when clouds had covered even the moon. The village sunk in shadow while a storm moved low over the hills, its rain running like cold beads along the roof slates and gutters. Inside the cathedral the candles burned with their usual hush of gold, yet it was the windows above the altar that drew your eyes first, for they carried light though no sun or torch stood behind them to explain its source. The glass glowed with the faintness of breath upon a mirror, then slowly deepened until blues softened toward the color of evening lakes and reds, pooled like wine beneath a lantern where no lantern stood. You thought perhaps lightning was crossing the hills unseen, its pale flicker arriving too quietly for thunder. Yet the sky beyond the windows stayed as black as a locked cellar door, the rain steady but unbroken by any spark or flash. The figures in the glass Mary bending toward the child, the tall prophet lifting his scroll grew clearer as the glow deepened, until their robes and halos carried a warmth like coals banked carefully for winter. You stepped closer, the floor cooled through the soles of your boots, the air smelling of rain drifting through the open slats high above. Yet the windows themselves breathed a calm brightness, as though dawn had wandered in too early and grown lost. No flame wavered near them, no lamp or taper crouched in the aisles below, yet the colors poured across the floor slowly, like cloth drawn from a chest where it had been folded many years and only now met air again. The glassworkers had set tiny imperfections into each panel, bubbles like caught rain, faint swirls where sand had cooled unevenly, yet tonight even those shone softly, each flaw carrying its own trembling point of light, as if painted by invisible hands. You felt the warmth rising faintly from the stones beneath the windows, though the rest of the cathedral stayed cool. The air near the pews thin enough for your breath to show whenever the doors opened on the storm outside. The priest arrived at last, with his lantern drawn low against the wind, his robes scattered with rain. But even he paused before the altar, as the glow touched his lined face like a familiar hand whose name he could not remember. No words passed between you, because none seemed shaped for this quietness, the kind that lay over the building like snow, where no birds sang and no wind moved the trees. Only this patient brightness leaning across the walls and floor. The figures in the windows looked neither alive nor still, their eyes lowered as always, yet the longer you watched, the more the light seemed to lift from within rather than falling upon them from any world you knew outside. The storm went on for hours, with its long threads of rain drawn through the dark, the village steeped in night. Yet here the windows held their color without fading, as though the sun had left some echo of itself trapped behind the glass. One child who had come seeking her father in the choir loft stood very still beside you, her small hand clutching the bench, the glow sliding softly across her cheek, until she whispered whether the saints themselves had brought lanterns tonight. The priest only shook his head, his eyes lowered as though afraid to break whatever held the light in place. The air carrying no warmth from flame or hearth, yet filled with a brightness that never hurt the eyes to meet it. When at last the rain slackened and the clouds thinned toward dawn, the glow slowly ebbed like water leaving a tide pool, the blues paling first, then the reds, until only the ordinary glass remained where the faces looked down without expression. You walked the aisle once more before leaving, your boots echoing beneath the vaults, the scent of wet earth blowing through the door as the priest unlatched it. The sky outside pale with the color of ashes before the first sun broke. He never spoke of it again, though the villagers asked, saying they had seen the windows burning faintly through the rain, while the rest of the valley lay dark, as if the cathedral had drawn a small sun inside itself for one night only. Some evenings afterward you would sit near the altar when clouds gathered over the hills, half expecting the glow to return. But the windows stayed dark each time, the saints watching without light while the wind pawed softly at the shutters. And yet, whenever you pass them now, in daylight, with the sun pouring through as always, you find yourself wondering whether the colors carry some memory of that night when no sun shone. Yet the glass burned gently, as though lit from within, because even now, years later, you cannot quite stand before them without feeling that faint warmth brushing your skin. Like a secret the windows keep, though no one asks them, something waiting patiently behind the painted eyes and folded robes. It leaves you certain that light does not always come from the sky, nor warmth from any fire you can name, but sometimes from places where neither wind nor rain nor even the night itself can follow. And though the storm has long passed, the memory of that glow still hangs like breath in the rafters, softer than any dawn you have ever seen, too quiet to to explain, too gentle to forget. Sometimes the night carried a breath through the cathedral that was not the wind's, a stirring so slow you could almost believe it rose from the stones themselves, as if the building were exhaling after centuries of holding its own secrets tight. It came most often on evenings when the moon leaned low against the horizon, pale and watchful, sending its narrow light through the high windows in soft ribbons dulled by dust. So faint you could see the motes floating like tired stars among the beams. On such nights, the air inside the nave seemed heavier, gathering in the arches, high above, like unseen water pooling in a deep well, and you would feel the weight of it in your chest, even as the silence pressed around you. Along the northern transept there stood a door older than the rest, its wood dark as river stones, long buried beneath current and time, its surface cracked into fine patterns like dried earth, its ironwork crooked with the fatigue of centuries. It sagged a little on its frame, as though the wall itself leaned to carry its weight. The stone there darker, too, touched by dampness in seasons when rain pressed its long fingers through the mortar, leaving pale traces of lichen in the corners. No one alive seemed to know its story, for even the oldest parishioners, the ones whose faces were lined like the cathedral's own carvings, said they had never seen it opened, nor met anyone who claimed to possess the right key. The hinges curled outward like bits of ancient script, deep brown with rust, the sort of rust so old it no longer stained your fingers, for it had hardened into the metal-like memory itself, unshaken by wind or water or time. The keyhole was narrow and oddly shaped, leaning slightly as though carved by a hand unused to perfect lines. You would pass it often in the evenings, when the candles burned low along the side aisles, when the sound of prayer had softened to whispers, and the whole cathedral felt like a creature half asleep, breathing in stone and light. Sometimes you paused there, not because you wished to go through it, but because standing near it filled you with the sense of being close to something that had waited far longer than your life could measure, something patient beyond years. There were nights when the silence near the door felt different than elsewhere, not merely the absence of noise, but a presence of listening, as though the air there leaned toward you, waiting, holding its breath against your own. Once, long ago, you laid your palm upon its wood, expecting only the chill of oak and iron, but instead you felt a warmth faint as the last ember in a hearth, as though the door held its own small sun deep inside. You told no one about that, for how could you explain a warmth in a door that had not opened for centuries, in a place where drafts ruled the corners, and even the candles often bent toward unseen winds? Still, after that evening, you found yourself slowing whenever you passed near it, glancing sideways as though the door might notice, as though it waited for the moment when someone would at last give it their full attention. There was a particular night when the air carried the weight of rain, cool and metallic, drifting through the high windows from some distant storm, and the candles along the side aisle leaned slightly though no one walked near them. You felt it first in your feet, a faint tremor through the floor like the smallest bell struck far below. And when you turned your head, you saw the door shift by a measure so small it might have been the trick of your breath. But then came the sound, low and long, like a single note of some deep instrument played behind thick walls, not loud enough to startle, only enough to make your heart lean forward inside your chest to listen better. No one else seemed to hear it, for the few figures scattered through the pews remained bent over their prayers. their faces dipping toward the flicker of their own candles, shadows moving across their cheeks like moth wings. The door moved again, slowly, its wood sighing against the frame, and a line of gold light appeared along its edge, thin as the rim of the moon before it rises, trembling as though it too were uncertain about being seen. It was not the jagged light of torches, nor the warm sputter of lamps, but a steady, breathing glow, the kind of glow that made you think of long summers when the sun clung to the fields even after the birds had gone quiet. The scent reached you then, soft but unmistakable, a smell unlike anything in the cathedral where dust and wax and old incense usually ruled the air. For this was green and rain-sweet, carrying the memory of leaves unfolding after a storm. It was not the perfume of flowers cut for altars, nor the thick smoke of ceremonial burning, but something freer, wilder, as though a meadow in spring had been folded carefully behind that narrow line of light, waiting for release. The hinges gave one final groan, though softer than before, almost like a voice clearing its throat before a song. And then the door stood open just wide enough for the golden glow to pour across the stones at your feet. You did not move toward it, not out of fear, for nothing in its light felt threatening, but because the glow itself seemed to reach outward, crossing the space between you before you could decide whether to cross it yourself. Through the opening you thought you glimpsed a path, not made of stone like the cathedral floor, but of something pale and smooth, curving out of sight as though leading into a distance where footsteps would make no sound at all. There were shapes, too, faint as breath on glass, not people exactly, but presences, the way sunlight sometimes makes you imagine voices on water too far to hear, stirring something inside you without ever resolving into words. The air grew warmer as you stood there, yet the chill of the cathedral did not retreat, and the two temperatures met around you like seasons, folding briefly together before parting again into winter and summer. A figure passed behind you then, carrying a basket of candles toward the altar, their steps slow, deliberate, unaware, and by the time you turned back, the door was closed again, the light gone, the scent fading into stone and dust. The hinges hung silent, as though they had never moved, the wood dark, cold, blank. You stood for a long while listening, waiting for the sound again, the breath, the glow, the wild spring scent. But there was nothing except the ordinary creak of benches and the far shuffle of someone sweeping the outer hall. You think, sometimes, you hear the faint sigh of that door shifting, almost ready, almost awake, almost willing to open again. And each time you wonder whether one evening the glow will return, whether someone not necessarily you will finally step through, and what kind of world waits behind a door that carries sunlight in its breath after centuries of stone and silence. Long before dawn ever touched the hills, the stones of the cathedral seemed to hum faintly, a vibration so soft you might have mistaken it for your own heartbeat echoing through the cool, candlelit nave. The air carried the scent of damp earth drifting from the open doors, mingling with the faint smoke of last night's candles, a mixture that smelled of memory and time, of winters long past and summers that had never quite left. Each pillar, smooth and worn where hands had traced the carved saints, vibrated faintly underfoot, a subtle resonance that seemed to travel from foundation to vault, curling around the arches like the whisper of wind through autumn leaves. Feeling the cathedral's low voice brush against your ribs, a sound neither loud nor measured, but patient, as if the building were waking from a deep, unbroken sleep. The windows filtered the moonlight in fragile shards of silver and blue, and the light mingled with the low hum in the walls, making each figure of saint or prophet shimmer as though the glass itself were breathing with the stone. The benches were cold beneath your hands when you ran your fingers across their polished surfaces, the lingering scent of wax and pine pitch rising in little waves, and it seemed for a moment that even the furniture listened to the cathedral's stirring. In the corners, shadows pooled softly, yet they were no longer heavy or oppressive, for the hum in the stones lent them a quiet warmth, a feeling that you were not alone but accompanied by the building itself in its gentle awakening. The doorways along the side aisles seemed to sigh as you passed, the heavy oaken doors rattling slightly in their frames without wind, a small vibration that joined the cathedral's subtle voice, as though it was drawing the whole structure into the song. You knelt near the altar, the cold stone pressing against your knees, and the resonance grew warmer there, carrying through the floor like a pulse that matched your own, though deeper, older, as though it had been set by hands long since dust. It was not music as you knew it, not notes shaped by voices or instruments, but a layering of tone and vibration that wrapped itself around the air, the stones, the candles, the very breath in your lungs, until the cathedral seemed to hum with life. Your fingers traced the smooth curve of a column, and the warmth leaped faintly along your skin, the hum shifting with the touch, as though the building recognized your presence and shaped itself in response to your careful attention. Above you, the arches shivered faintly, tiny movements like a sigh escaping centuries of stillness, and the choir loft, empty of singers, seemed to carry the resonance higher, scattering it in long threads that brushed the stained glass with gentle fingers. The light in the windows caught those threads and refracted them into tiny arcs across the floor, making the air glitter with invisible motion, each particle catching the hum in a way that seemed alive, like the breath of the cathedral had taken form. The candles along the nave flickered gently, though no breeze moved them, their flames bending in response to vibrations in the stones, so that the light itself appeared to dance to music no ear could hear, a choreography older than memory. Your own breath slowed as you listened, each inhale pulling the low hum into your lungs, each exhale letting it spill again across the walls. And you realized the building's voice was not a sound to hear, but a presence to feel. In the vestry, the tapestry walls shivered lightly, as though aware, the threads vibrating along with the stone, carrying the sound like a river moving silently beneath a frozen surface, pulling at your attention without urging you forward. The smell of the old wood, mixed with the faint warmth of wax from the candles, became sharper, more present, as if each note of vibration carried scent along with it, a layering of senses that made you feel both inside and outside of time, as if the cathedral's song had roots that reached deep into the earth, pulling the pulse of the valley itself into its rising tone. You wandered to the nave again, tracing the line of pillars with your fingertips, feeling the hum grow stronger there, a steady undercurrent that seemed to rise from the stone, travel through the beams, and spill over the arches in long, low waves. Yet the feeling of it was unmistakable. The building was awake, singing without sound, carrying within itself a memory of voices long silent but not gone. You leaned your forehead against the cold stone of a pillar, the resonance pressing softly through your skull, and imagined that this song had been humming for centuries, waiting for someone patient enough to feel it, patient enough to sit still and listen. as though attempting to touch the invisible threads of tone, to trace the pattern that filled the space between walls, windows, and your own presence. The resonance rose gradually, not in volume but in weight, like the cathedral was gathering itself in preparation, drawing every stone, every beam, every piece of air into its long, slow chorus. And you felt privileged to be the only one aware. Even when the wind outside pressed against the doors and rattled the windows, the sound inside remained steady, uninterrupted by weather, as though the building had learned to protect its song from distraction, a private music carried only in its bones. You moved slowly along the aisle, brushing your hand across the benches, feeling the slight hum deepen in response, and understood that the cathedral's song was not a melody to follow, but a rhythm to inhabit, a pulse to let fold into your own. In the corners where shadows lay thickest, the vibration shifted subtly, the low resonance seeming to draw the darkness into itself rather than repel it, so that the shadows no longer felt heavy but softened like wool, warm and calm under the building's invisible hands. The sense of time changed as you listened, each moment stretching into the next, until the night outside, the storm in the valley, and even your own pulse seemed secondary to the steady, patient song of stone and glass and memory. When dawn finally crept into the high windows, pale and cautious, the resonance did not vanish but lingered. Faint now, a sigh within the walls, a whisper of what had begun in the night and would remain just beneath perception even as light and wind returned. You left the cathedral slowly, each step reluctant, carrying the feeling with you like water trapped in your clothing. The warmth of the stones and the hum of the song pressed softly into your chest, as if the building had offered a secret it trusted you to keep. And sometimes when you return, you feel the hum rise again, faint at first, curling in corners, brushing against pillars, tugging at your senses, reminding you that the cathedral sings always, quietly, for anyone patient enough to listen with more than ears. It is a song without words, a song without singers, and yet it is full, alive, carrying memory, warmth, and the slow, deliberate pulse of a structure older than voices, older than wind, older even than the stars that drift above the valley in their endless rotation. In the far end of the cathedral, beneath the lofty arches where the light filtered pale and slow through the tall windows, the great organ stood silent, a sleeping giant of wood and brass that smelled faintly of beeswax and old varnish. Its pipes rose like towers of silver and bronze, polished but not bright, each one a small cathedral of its own, reflecting the narrow shafts of moonlight and the flicker of candles with a faint, warm shimmer across their curved surfaces. You ran your fingers along the carved keys, smooth and cool beneath your touch, feeling the subtle weight of the mechanisms beneath, the tension of springs and levers that had not moved in hours, or perhaps years, depending on how long silence had held here. The smell of wax, of dust pressed into the corners, and the faint temps of iron from the pipes mingled in the air. A scent that seemed to speak of centuries of hands, fingers long gone, shaping the music that the organ could hold but had not yet released. The first note came softly, almost unnoticed, a vibration so faint you might have mistaken it for the hum in the stones. Yet it lingered in your chest, pressing gently against the ribs, a warmth that drew your attention fully to the instrument. You inhaled, and the scent of wood polished by time mingled with the faintly floral smell of rain drawn through open doors. a mixture that made you feel as though the cathedral itself had leaned close, exhaling slowly into the nave. The second note followed, deeper this time, like the voice of some hidden creature echoing from the vaults, resonant enough to stir the dust motes in the air, so that the very light seemed to dance in response to the sound. You did not move your hands, though the temptation to play was there, for the keys lifted by themselves in delicate arcs, each note ringing clear and full, yet never loud enough to startle, only enough to fill the space with the cathedral's quiet song. It was a music without urgency, a composition that had no name, written in the folds of air and stone, the careful curves of light and shadow, and in the small rise and fall of your own breath as you listened without moving. The lower pipes hummed faintly, a gentle undertone beneath the high notes that fluttered across the nave, and you felt the vibration through the soles of your boots, the resonance climbing slowly, brushing the arches above, as if the cathedral itself were joining in. The candles along the aisles flickered gently, their light swaying in long arcs as the sound passed over them, and you realized that the music was not only heard but felt, the building alive with it, each stone and beam vibrating in subtle concord. Your hands hovered above the keys, not daring to touch, and yet the notes continued, each one bending slightly as though shaped by invisible fingers, soft and patient, a lullaby composed by centuries and whispered through the organ's body. The smell of the wood, warm and dry, mixed with the faintest tang of metallic pipes, and you imagined the air moving along the channels beneath the floor, carrying the music like a river beneath the cathedral, unseen but always present. You leaned forward slightly, pressing your face toward the lower pipes, and the vibration there was almost tactile, a gentle pulse against your skin, making the hair on your arms rise and fall in time with the hidden rhythms of the organ. Somewhere behind the loft, a draft moved faintly, though no door opened, and the music bent around it, a subtle swaying that made the notes shimmer, not in pitch, but in the way the air held them, like a curtain breathing in the wind. You could feel the stone walls respond to the arches and pillars seeming to stretch inward just enough to catch the tones, the vibrations slipping along the surfaces, pooling in shadowed corners, and leaving a trace of warmth wherever it lingered. The keys moved in gentle patterns, repeating phrases that rose and fell slowly, a melody that felt like a memory remembered by the cathedral itself, sung without voice, guided only by the long patience of stone and wood and time. You noticed that even the pews seemed to lean subtly toward the sound, the polished wood catching reflections of candlelight in tiny ripples, as though the furniture itself were breathing in the music and exhaling it softly. A faint smell of rain arrived from the high windows, mingling with the candle smoke, the wax, and the varnish, a layering of scents that made the experience tactile as well as auditory, so that you felt the song not only in your ears, but across your skin and chest. The resonance rose gradually, not in volume but in depth, wrapping around the nave like a slow tide, pressing softly against the walls, the pillars, the arches, as though the cathedral were embracing you in a long, gentle exhale. Your eyes traced the heights of the organ, the pipes stretching up toward the rafters, and you imagined the sound climbing along them, echoing against the beams, scattering into every corner, every shadow, every patch of moonlight that had found its way inside. The music bent subtly as it traveled, the notes warping slightly to fill each niche and alcove, each curve and carving, until the building seemed to hum as one, a body of stone and wood carrying the invisible breath of song. You felt it in your chest, a slow, patient rhythm, a warmth that rose like water against your skin. And for a moment, the distinction between the organ, the cathedral, and yourself blurred, until you were nothing more than a vessel for the music to pass through. The light from the candles danced across the walls in response to the vibration, making halos of motion around the painted saints, so that they seemed alive, their faces catching the tone in small ways that made them glow faintly against the stone. Outside, the wind shifted, brushing against the open doors and rattling the outer windows. But the organ's voice did not falter, its notes steady, patient, as though the cathedral had learned to guard its song against the disturbances of the world. You walked slowly along the nave, following the rise and fall of the music, tracing your hand along the smooth stone of the pillars, feeling the hum deepen beneath your fingertips, each note a small vibration through the very bones of the building. It was impossible to tell how long the organ played, for time seemed suspended, the song not measured in minutes, but in the careful unfolding of air and vibration, each note falling into the next, like water drawn over stone for centuries. The warmth of the sound pooled near the altar, brushing your skin as though the building exhaled into your chest, filling you with a calm that had no name, a presence that was neither living nor entirely stone, but something quietly in between. When you finally stepped away, the organ slowed, the notes lingering in the air like mist, fading gradually until only the faintest echo remained. The building resuming its usual hush, though you could still feel the vibration underfoot, like the memory of a long dream. You left the nave slowly, the smell of wax and wood and faint rain clinging to your clothes and hair, carrying with you the feeling that the cathedral's song had imprinted itself gently upon your body and mind, a secret warmth only you could hold. Even now, when the doors are closed and the nave is empty, you can almost hear it in the quietest hours, a thread of music weaving through the air, the memory of the organ playing by itself, patient, gentle, and impossibly alive. And sometimes, if you sit very still in the cathedral at night, you feel the vibration rise again beneath your feet, a slow, unspoken melody that reminds you that the building is alive, singing always, though no choir stands to guide its voice. High above, in the shadowed belfry, where the air smelled faintly of iron and cedar, the great bells rested, enormous and still, their surfaces darkened by years of weather, their mouths hollow with the memory of countless rings that had long since faded into silence. The moonlight poured through the narrow openings, falling in long shafts across the beams, and the wood of the belfry seemed to drink it in, the grain deepening in color, as if the building itself were aware of the silver wash of night. You climbed the narrow stairs slowly, hand pressed against the cool stone of the wall, feeling the vibrations of the cathedral beneath your feet, subtle and persistent, as though the structure were guiding you upward toward some quiet revelation. Each step smelled of dust and cedar, of centuries of footsteps pressed into the worn wood, and faintly of candle smoke, lingering from the nights when the cathedral was fully alive with the soft prayers of its people. The air grew thinner as you neared the top, carrying a faint chill mixed with the warmth of sun-baked beams, and the sound of the cathedral's distant hum from the nave below traveled upward, threading its way through the walls into the belfry itself. You paused, hand resting on the railing, and looked at the bells, magnificent and still, their curved surfaces catching the pale moonlight. their shadows stretching across the wood in tall, silent echoes of sound that might have been, or might yet come. Then, without warning, the largest bell trembled faintly, a low vibration that pressed against the bones of the building and the soles of your feet. A presence more than a sound, felt rather than heard, as if the bell were breathing slowly in its suspended quiet. The smaller bells responded in turn, lifting a subtle chorus that pulsed through the belfry, each tone delicate and patient, weaving together into a harmony that the air seemed to hold gently, a song not summoned by hands, but born of the cathedral itself. It smelled of iron and cedar more strongly now, with the faintest trace of rain drawn through the open louvers, a mingling of earth and wood and time, grounding the music in a tangible, almost tactile way that pressed softly against your senses. The largest bell lifted again, and this time the sound traveled outward, spilling through the high openings and scattering across the rooftops, across the courtyard, brushing the stone walls of the nave in long, slow waves that made the building itself seem to vibrate in answer. You leaned forward slightly, the wind catching your hair and clothes, carrying the resonance outward, and yet the sound returned in soft echoes, curling back along the beams and the rafters, as though the cathedral were breathing in, then releasing its voice in gentle sighs. The movement of the bells was subtle, almost imperceptible, their sway measured and slow. Yet the vibrations filled the space so completely that you could feel them in your chest. A resonance older than you and almost alive, a pulse that connected you to the stone beneath your feet. Somewhere far below, the candles along the nave flickered in response, though no wind stirred them, bending their flames as though they too were aware of the unseen music rising above. A delicate choreography of light in conversation with vibration. The smell of the belfry deepened, the warm cedar pressing gently against your senses, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of the bells themselves, a reminder that these enormous instruments were solid and ancient, yet capable of singing without anyone's hand. You placed your palm on the largest bell, feeling its low, steady hum through the cold metal, a resonance that traveled slowly along your arm and into your chest, carrying with it a sense of continuity, of time folded into itself, and of history waiting to be remembered. The smaller bells shifted in harmony, their notes soft but insistent, a conversation among themselves in tones that no human could match. The sound moving across the belfry, up to the rafters, and spilling outward, filling the cathedral like a river of invisible light. Your eyes traced the beams above, worn and polished by years of gravity and time, and you imagined the sound weaving through each joint and curve, bending against the old wood, scattering in delicate arcs across the walls, carrying a warmth that made the air shimmer. It was not music in any conventional sense, yet it was complete, self-contained, and alive. A song that belonged to the building rather than any voice. A lullaby pressed into the very bones of stone and timber, rising slowly through arches and pillars alike. You pressed your face to the railing, feeling the vibration of the largest bell echo along the beams into your body, a warmth that was neither fire nor sunlight, but something quieter, older, and patient, as though the cathedral itself had remembered its own pulse. The sound shifted, the smaller bells creating subtle ripples, blending into chords that seemed to settle in corners, linger in shadowed spaces, and travel upward toward the vaulted ceiling, where moonlight pooled and scattered across the carved angels, frozen in stone. It was almost impossible to tell if time had passed or paused entirely. For the song seemed to exist outside the normal rules of hours and minutes. A rhythm older than clocks, measured only by the rise and fall of sound in the silent air. You leaned against the railing, inhaling the faint scent of rain drawn through open louvers, mingling with cedar and iron and candle smoke, a layering of presence that made the music tactile, almost visible, pressing gently against your skin like the softest brush of wings. The bells continued to sway slowly, each vibration harmonizing with the others, not loud, not jarring, but persistent and patient. A choir of metal singing without singers, a language older than memory and more intimate than any voice. Somewhere below, the nave seemed to hum in response, the echo of organ notes mingling with the high voices of the bells, creating a delicate interwoven music of stone, wood, and air, as though the cathedral itself were composing a lullaby from its many parts. The wind moved gently through the belfry openings, tugging at the edges of your cloak, yet the bells remained steady, carrying their tones across the rafters, through the arches, out into the still night, shaping sound without effort, without hands, and without pause. You rested your hand against the iron of the railing, feeling the subtle tremor of centuries, the pulse of the cathedral itself, alive in music, alive in stone, a quiet, patient song that existed entirely within the body of the building and in the spaces it created. The largest bell lifted slightly again, the resonance rising gently, almost imperceptibly, until you could feel it wrap around your chest, brushing the edges of your mind like sunlight over a winter field, warming and soft, subtle and insistent. The smaller bells chimed lightly, the sound delicate and precise, echoing in corners and across the beams, falling like drops of rain on stone, blending with the faint hum that had been rising from the cathedral's walls and floors for hours, or perhaps centuries. You stepped back slowly, letting the music wash over you one final time, the smell of cedar and iron lingering in your hair. The vibration pressed faintly into your feet, carrying with it the certainty that the cathedral's song would continue, patient, gentle, eternal. Even now, long after you leave the belfry and the bells have stilled, the memory of their resonance lingers, threading itself through your thoughts, a quiet reminder that the cathedral is alive, singing always, even when no one is there to hear its voice. High along the walls, the stained glass windows held the faint memory of sunlight and candlelight, their colors muted in the quiet hours, yet alive in the way they refracted even the smallest flickers, scattering them like whispers across the stone floor. You moved slowly beneath them, fingertips brushing the cold carved sills, feeling the subtle coolness of the glass beneath your skin and the faint warmth carried from the sun trapped in centuries-old panes that had known far more light than you could imagine. The air carried a scent of rain from the high windows, mingled with faint dust and a lingering sweetness of old candles, a perfume that made the cathedral feel alive, breathing quietly in the spaces between arches, walls, and your own careful footsteps. Sometimes, as you paused beneath a window, you felt a subtle vibration, a trace of movement in the glass that was not caused by wind but by something quieter, older, as if the light itself wanted to speak in tones too soft for ordinary ears. The colors shifted subtly, the reds and blues and golds bending toward you in delicate waves, making the faces of saints and angels flicker with motion, as if they were leaning forward to share a secret only you could receive in silence. You could smell the faint metallic temps of the lead framing the glass, warmed slightly by the day's light and cooled again by the night, a scent that pressed softly against your senses, reminding you of the cathedral's patience, its long history of seeing and hearing without interruption. Sometimes you imagined that if you leaned close enough, the windows would whisper to you, each pane carrying a different note of memory. The voices of those who had placed them there, each flicker of color a syllable, each shadow a pause between words. The texture of the sills beneath your fingers was uneven, worn smooth in some places by countless hands, rough in others where time had left its mark. A reminder that the cathedral's touch was everywhere, patient, gentle, persistent, like the flow of water over stone. Outside, the wind shifted in the eaves, brushing against the upper panes, and the sound filtered through the glass in tiny, delicate murmurs that seemed carried by the colored light itself, so that every shape of a saint or angel became animated with soundless stories. The candlelight along the aisle caught the windows in fragile arcs, refracting across the floor in ribbons of color that curved and shimmered. And for a moment, it was as if the air itself had been painted. The cathedral, breathing in pigments of gold, crimson, and sapphire. You leaned against the nearest pillar, feeling the gentle vibration of the stone beneath your palm, and sensed the windows vibrating in harmony, as if the cathedral's pulse had reached them and set them singing softly in ways that no human voice could reproduce. The scent of old wood and wax mingled with the faint rustle of leaves from outside, carried upward by drafts that no one could see, wrapping around you, pressing gently against your chest, a reminder that the building itself had memory and intention, even in silence. When you looked up, the figures in the glass seemed to bend slightly toward you, their eyes catching the light in ways that made them appear alive, each movement subtle, rhythmic, as if the entire cathedral exhaled through these windows, sending breath made of color across the air. Your fingers brushed along the cold stone beneath the sills, tracing patterns your eyes could not follow, and the vibration of glass, light, and stone intertwined, a quiet resonance that pressed softly into your senses, a sound you could feel rather than hear. Sometimes a note of wind would enter through a high window, lifting the dust in the air. And for a heartbeat, you felt the colors pulse in response, subtle as a heartbeat, making the saints' faces shimmer like water disturbed by the gentlest ripple. The scent of rain grew stronger, sweet and earthy, touching your skin like a memory of summer storms long past. And the windows seemed to collect it, hold it, and release it slowly across the nave, so that every footstep carried the echo of weather from outside. The long shadows of the frames stretched across the stone floor in waves, moving imperceptibly as if guided by some hidden rhythm, and you felt yourself leaning closer to catch the nuances of their motion, knowing that each shift contained some fragment of the cathedral's hidden story. You pressed your palm to the cold stone once more, and felt the slight tremor from the organ and the distant bells below, the sound traveling upward, caressing the glass with invisible hands. The windows themselves participating in a song that was older than voices, the light that filtered through reflected into your eyes as soft halos, warming the lids and cheeks, and you felt as though the cathedral had folded you into its embrace, the whispers of glass, stone, and color wrapping around you like a familiar, forgotten memory. A candle flickered and threw its shadow across the pane, and for a moment the figures appeared to move, lifting hands, bowing heads, leaning forward in unison as though recognizing your presence, acknowledging the quiet patience with which you had chosen to listen. The vibrations were subtle, but you could feel them traveling up your arms as your hands rested on the stone, moving like a pulse, linking you to the glass, the beams, the walls, the long, patient heartbeat of a building older than the people who had shaped it. Outside, the storm gathered strength, tapping faintly on the windows above the nave. Yet the whispers from the colored panes remained undisturbed, as if the cathedral itself had built a shield around its voice, letting only those patient enough to notice hear its secrets. You walked slowly along the aisle, letting your fingertips brush the sills of each window, feeling the textures, inhaling the mingled scents of wood, wax, and rain, letting the vibrations in the glass pass into you, as though the cathedral were pouring its story directly into your being. The figures seemed to lean ever so slightly with each step you took, their eyes catching stray light, making you imagine them alive with knowledge. A chorus of silent voices, singing in color and shadow, leaving traces of warmth and memory behind with each bend of the panes. Sometimes, if you listened long enough, you could feel the windows themselves guiding your gaze, drawing you to colors you might have overlooked, to shapes and faces that flickered like thoughts on the edge of consciousness, fragments of stories older than you could name. The scent of candle smoke thickened near the altar, mingling with the faint metallic temps of rain from the high windows, and you felt the resonance in the glass travel along the stone, through arches and pillars, a subtle tide of memory and light brushing your senses. You pressed your forehead to the cold sill once more, feeling the vibrations in the stone, the glass, the air, and understood that the windows carried more than light. They held the faint echoes of voices, the patience of centuries, the cathedral's quiet invitation to witness its hidden life. The colors shifted again, slow and subtle, and the faces of saints and angels shimmered with what you might call intention. Though the cathedral never spoke aloud, letting the light, the glass, and your own presence form a conversation that needed no words. Even when you left the aisle and walked to the nave, the echo of their whispers lingered, carried gently in the air and light, a quiet reminder that the cathedral sings always, not just in music or bells, but in the subtle pulse of color and shadow pressed into its walls. And sometimes, when the sun rises pale and cautious, or when the wind drifts through the eaves, you feel the glass hum faintly beneath your fingertips, a whisper that is older than voice, older than stone, a patient song for anyone willing to pause, to see, to remember. And the cool stone beneath your feet carries the faint warmth of centuries, pressing softly into your souls, as if the earth itself remembers every step ever taken here. The air smells of damp moss, sun-warmed stone, and the faint tang of flowers that have survived through shadow and rain. A mixture so subtle that it feels alive, brushing against your skin like a memory you almost recognize. And for a moment, you imagine the cloisters breathing softly in rhythm with the cathedral's hidden pulse, turning the surface warm beneath your fingers as you trace the carved lines of the balustrades, feeling every groove and curve like a soft conversation between past hands and your own. A delicate voice of water rolling over stone, and the sound blends with the low hum that travels through the walls from the nave, creating a chorus of motion and resonance that fills the cloisters with invisible music. You inhale slowly, the scent of wet stone and earth rising from the garden, mingling with the faint smell of candle smoke from the cathedral beyond, and the combination makes the air feel tangible, a quiet cloak draped around your shoulders. And you sense the cloisters themselves leaning into it, their arches and stones expanding imperceptibly to carry the resonance. Each exhale sending it back into the arches, making you feel as though the cloisters recognize you, patient and gentle as you are. Feeling the coolness pressed beneath your palm and the subtle vibration of the building's pulse. A presence that is neither harsh nor intrusive, but tender, patient, and quietly alive beneath the surface, making the cloisters feel simultaneously grounded and fluid, as though you are walking through a place that exists both in the past and in the gentle present. Each bead reflecting a fragment of color that seems to echo the cathedral's own hum, shimmering across stone and leaf alike, and the delicate green of moss recesses in layers, mingling with the stone's faint warmth. And it feels almost as though the cloisters exhale these fragrances deliberately, a slow, rhythmic pulse of presence and memory. You lean against one of the columns, feeling the cold stone press against your cheek, and the subtle vibration that travels through it carries the hum from the nave, intertwining with the whisper of the fountain, creating a sound you feel more than hear, a lullaby of architecture and life. The air shimmers with the faintest hint of heat from the sun striking stone, and the movement of leaves and water creates patterns of light that ripple across your vision, like a dream caught in slow motion, fragile and alive with unseen motion. A small bird moves along the edge of the garden, its wings stirring the air faintly, and the sound of its feet brushing leaves seems to harmonize with the cloister's pulse, as though all living things here are in quiet dialogue with the building's memory. You press your palm against the stone floor near the fountain, feeling the gentle tremor that travels upward, carrying echoes from the bells above and the organ below. And the combination of stone, water, and air resonates like a body breathing softly in the warm morning light. And you notice the subtle color of the stone shift under it, warm grays turning to golden tones as the sun climbs higher, and the cloisters seem to glow faintly from the inside out. And carved edge seems to lean toward you, carrying centuries of stillness in the most gentle and deliberate way. The scent of earth and moss rises more strongly near the far corner, the stone cooler beneath your fingers, and the shadows gather softly in the arches, not oppressive, but protective, like the subtle embrace of a place that has known solitude yet offers comfort. You kneel briefly to press your palms to the floor, feeling the warmth from the sun-drenched stones mix with the vibration traveling up from the cathedral, and you realize that the cloisters are alive in a quiet, patient way, holding their own breath alongside yours. The sound of water from the fountain rises and falls in a slow, deliberate rhythm, each droplet a tiny note in the cathedral's larger composition, blending with the resonance of stone and arches to form a lullaby meant for anyone who moves through this space with careful attention. The ivy's shadows shift subtly, dancing along the walls in the sunlight, and for a moment it feels as if the cloisters themselves are breathing, expanding and contracting, exhaling warmth and light into the quiet corners where moss and stone meet. You pause beneath an archway, closing your eyes and feeling the air brush your face. The vibration from the nave below and the fountain before you coalescing into a gentle pulse that wraps around you like a soft, invisible shawl, calm and reassuring. The scent of rain drifts faintly from the open cloister doors, mingling with the warmth of sun-warmed stone, and you inhale slowly, letting the fragrances and vibrations settle into you. The feeling of the cathedral and its quiet garden pressing softly against your chest. Your fingers trace the carved patterns along the columns, following the loops and spirals with deliberate care, and each groove seems to hum faintly beneath your touch, carrying with it the patient memory of centuries, a gentle conversation of stone and hand. The water in the fountain catches a glint of sunlight and scatters it across the walls, a slow play of moving light that reflects against the arches and floor, shimmering faintly like the pulse of life hidden within the stone itself, quiet but undeniable. You stand once more, feeling the cloisters around you, the air, stone, water, and ivy moving subtly as if the space is aware of your presence, breathing with you, letting the resonance of the cathedral below fill you with a gentle calm that seems impossible to measure. Even when you leave the cloisters and step back into the nave, the feeling lingers, the warmth of stone, the whisper of water, and the gentle pulse of arches following you. A quiet reminder that the cathedral breathes slowly, patiently, always, even in the absence of any voice. And sometimes, when you return to this place in the early hours, the cloisters seem to exhale softly, brushing your skin with cool air, lifting the scent of moss and earth, and reminding you that life here is quiet but persistent, a heartbeat folded into stone, water, and light. The cathedral's shadows stretched long and slow along the stone floors, reaching into corners and curling around pillars like old fingers, soft and patient, carrying with them a quiet memory of centuries that had unfolded beneath the vaulted ceiling. You walked carefully along the aisles, feeling the subtle chill of shadow brushing against your skin, the coolness carrying the faint scent of stone warmed by sunlight earlier in the day, and the lingering warmth of candlelight now faded. The arches above you cast gentle darkness across the walls, each curve and column painting a slow, fluid rhythm that seemed alive, and when you paused, the shadows seemed to shift ever so slightly, as though recognizing your presence in the quiet light. Some shadows were thin and pale, delicate as whispers, while others clung to the stone like soft velvet, and the contrast between them created a gentle dance that moved through the cathedral in tandem with the distant hum of hidden resonance. You leaned against a pillar, fingertips brushing the cool surface, and felt the shadows press faintly against your hand, not with weight, but with presence, a subtle acknowledgement that they had been here long before you arrived, and would linger long after. The scent of old wood, faint incense, and sun-warmed stone carried softly on the still air, blending with the shadows in a way that made them feel tactile, as if you could almost reach into the darkness and hold the past like water flowing slowly through your fingers. The deeper corners seemed to remember everything, the flicker of candles, the whispered prayers, the soft shuffle of feet, and even the quiet hum of bells that had long since ceased. As if the shadows themselves stored fragments of every sound ever heard within these walls. You stepped lightly across the floor, and the echoes of your own movement stretched into the darkness, blending with the memory held in the shadows, creating a dialogue between now and then that was invisible but deeply felt in the hollow beneath your chest. Sunlight from high windows touched the stone in slanted golden beams, and the shadows shifted delicately in response, curling around the edges of carvings and statues, and you could almost see the slow breathing of the cathedral expressed in the movement of light and dark. You traced the edge of a shadow along the floor with your eyes, noticing the way it softened and stretched as it met another. A subtle conversation of shape and tone that felt like a lullaby sung without sound, a patient song held in stillness and memory. The faint chill in the air seemed to gather in the shadows, pressing softly against your skin as you paused. And you realized that they carried not only the past, but also the quiet energy of the building itself. A gentle pulse of presence beneath your fingertips and feet. Your hands brushed lightly along a carved bench, and the shadow beneath it moved imperceptibly, as if acknowledging the contact, bending softly over the stone, and you felt the weight of centuries pressing gently into the quiet rhythm of the present moment. The distant hum of bells from the belfry and the faint murmur of water from the cloisters below intertwined with the darkness, and you could feel the shadows vibrating subtly in response, carrying the cathedral's song in tones that no human voice could replicate. A thin sliver of light from a narrow window caught dust motes, and the shadows around it seemed to curl in delicate spirals, creating shapes that hinted at figures frozen in time, ghostly yet gentle, like memories softened by age and the quiet patience of stone. You knelt briefly to touch the floor, feeling the texture of worn stone beneath your fingertips, and the shadows seemed to rise toward your hand, pressing softly with a weightless presence, as if the cathedral itself were leaning in to share its long-held stories. The air smelled faintly of rain carried from outside, mingling with the warmth of sun-baked stone, and the shadows seemed to respond, deepening in some corners, softening in others, like the slow exhalation of a breath held for centuries and finally released into the quiet space. You moved along the aisle again, letting the dark and light shift around you, and noticed how the shadows seemed almost conscious, bending delicately to follow your passage, wrapping the cathedral in a slow, deliberate choreography of presence and memory. The small alcoves along the walls held darker shadows that seemed to hum faintly with the resonance of the building, a subtle vibration you felt in your chest and fingertips, a reminder that the cathedral's voice existed not only in bells or voices, but in the quiet geometry of dark and light. You paused beneath a tall arch, looking up at the intricate carvings where shadow pooled in delicate folds, and you felt a gentle tremor pass through the air, as though the cathedral were acknowledging the hours you had spent moving quietly through its halls. The shadows along the floor shifted with the movement of light, bending around your feet and stretching toward the walls, a slow river of presence that carried the memory of all who had ever entered here, a testament to centuries of quiet devotion and patient attention. You rested your hand on the stone of a column, feeling its coolness pressed into your palm, and the darkness around it seemed to bend subtly, creating a cocoon of shadow and warmth, a gentle reminder that even the unseen has its own life, its own song. The faint scent of candle smoke drifted across the nave, and the shadows seemed to thicken slightly, wrapping the space in layers of presence, comforting and calm, as though the building itself had folded you into its long, quiet memory with no urgency or insistence. You moved slowly toward the altar, noticing how the shadows around it seemed to gather and separate in gentle patterns, like ink in water, tracing invisible lines across stone and tile, carrying with them the quiet history of every hand that had touched this place. The pulpit cast a long shadow across the floor, bending softly against the texture of stone, and you felt yourself drawn into it, aware that the darkness and light here were patient teachers, guiding you through a meditation on time, presence, and quiet reflection. A candle flickered in the distance, and its light caused shadows to shift ever so slightly, like the delicate movement of breathing, reminding you that even the smallest changes in the cathedral's environment were recorded in its patient, ancient memory. You rested your forehead against the cool stone of the altar step, and the shadows seemed to embrace you, pressing softly against your shoulders, wrapping the room in quiet layers of dark and light, holding the space like a soft, invisible hand that remembered everything. Even as you rose and stepped back toward the center of the nave, the shadows lingered, stretching, curling, bending subtly in response to your movement, a gentle, invisible presence that reminded you that the cathedral remembers everything, patient and calm as the centuries pass. The air smelled faintly of rain, candle smoke, and aged stone, and you inhaled slowly, letting the memory carried in shadow fill your senses. And as you exhaled, you realized the cathedral's story is not only told in sound or vision, but in the soft, deliberate language of darkness. The shadows continue their slow dance long after you leave, bending around columns, spreading across floors, resting in corners, and in their quiet, patient way, they keep the memory of every sound, every movement, every breath that has ever passed through this cathedral, alive, waiting. You step lightly toward the organ at the far end of the nave, the polished wood gleaming faintly in the soft light filtering through the stained glass windows. And the air feels thicker here, as though it has absorbed the weight of countless notes never played. The smell of varnish and old wood rises subtly as you approach, mixed with the faint sweetness of dust warmed by sunlight, and you feel the coolness of stone beneath your feet, grounding you while your senses reach for the quiet resonance that hangs in the air. The organ's pipes rise in perfect rows, silver and shadowed, like a forest frozen mid-breath, and you imagine the faint hum they carry even when untouched, a patient memory of music and vibration that rests quietly beneath the cathedral's vaulted ceilings. You reach out to the keys, your fingers hovering just above them, feeling the polished surface, the subtle ridges and grooves pressed into the wood. And for a moment you sense a stillness so complete it feels almost like a pulse waiting to be awakened. The air carries a delicate chill, mixed with the faint warmth of sunlight, and each inhalation brings the scent of waxed wood and old stone, a fragrance that presses softly against your senses, making the cathedral itself feel like a living, breathing presence in patient expectation. You notice the shadows of the pipes stretching across the floor, bending and lengthening in response to the shifting sun, and in the silence it seems as though they lean slightly forward, attentive, carrying the memory of every note, every chord that has ever filled this space. The faintest vibration travels through the stone floor as you stand near the organ, subtle and nearly imperceptible, a reminder that the building itself remembers the music long after hands have left the keys and voices have faded into air. A beam of sunlight strikes one row of pipes directly, and you see the silver glint of reflection ripple softly across the stone, like a gentle sigh, as though the organ itself is exhaling quietly, holding its memory in a fragile, perfect balance between sound and silence. You rest your hand lightly on the bench, feeling the smooth wood beneath your palm and the subtle warmth of long use, and the quiet resonance of the organ seems to press faintly into your chest, a reminder that silence can carry as much weight as sound. The faint scent of candle smoke drifts from the altar, mixing with the earthy aroma of the stone, and the space around the organ hums softly in harmony with the cathedral's quiet pulse, carrying a subtle vibration that you feel more than hear, deep in your bones. Your fingers brush lightly along the keys, noticing the subtle texture of worn wood, the slight unevenness of time pressed into the surface, and it feels as if the organ has stored every touch, every chord, every sigh of music, holding it gently in patient memory. The long shadows of the vaulted ceiling bend delicately toward the organ, and you sense them gathering, wrapping around the pipes in a silent embrace, carrying with them the memory of hands that once coaxed melody from this instrument in slow, deliberate devotion. You lean closer to the tallest pipes, inhaling the faint scent of metal and wood, and feel the vibration of the building subtly beneath your fingertips, a low, imperceptible rhythm that intertwines with your own pulse, tying you to the cathedral in a quiet communion. The sunlight shifts slightly, and the shadows along the pipes dance in slow motion, subtle as breath, and you imagine the organ's memory as a living thing, its silence pregnant with sound, patient, waiting for someone to stir it into life once more. You press your cheek against the polished wood of the bench, feeling the smoothness and the gentle tremor that travels faintly from the organ through the stone, and it is as if the cathedral itself has leaned in, sharing the weight of music held for centuries. A faint draft moves through the nave, brushing the edges of the keys and pipes, and the organ responds imperceptibly, the air vibrating just enough to awaken a memory deep within. Like the faint echo of a song sung long ago, held quietly in the bones of the instrument. You take a slow step back, letting your gaze sweep along the rows of pipes, each one catching light differently, each shadow holding the weight of unplayed notes, and for a moment, it feels as though the organ is breathing along with the cathedral, exhaling centuries of quiet devotion. The faint scent of rain from outside drifts through a high window, mingling with the warmth of sun-warmed stone, and the vibration of the building carries subtly through the organ, so that even in stillness, you can feel its song echo faintly, pressed into the very air. You run your fingertips lightly along the keys once more, tracing the grooves of wear, imagining the ghostly resonance of music filling the space, the organ remembering every note, storing them in silence, like a patient archivist preserving a treasure too precious to release. The distant hum of the nave, the soft vibration of the walls, and the faint rustle of air from open windows all mingle with the organ's quiet presence, a symphony of imperceptible sound and memory, carrying the cathedral's voice in tones you feel rather than hear. You notice how the sunlight highlights the intricate carvings along the wooden frame of the organ, and the shadows bend delicately in response, making the instrument appear almost alive, as though it waits for the right moment to awaken, and yet is content to simply exist. The scent of candle wax drifts faintly again, mixing with wood and metal, and the cathedral seems to pulse gently in time with your own heartbeat, the organ's memory folded into stone, wood, and air, a song held in quiet patience for anyone willing to linger. You kneel briefly to touch the cool stone floor at the organ's base, feeling the faint vibration that travels upward through the building, and the instrument seems to hum softly in response. An invisible melody, threaded through silence, felt in your chest and fingertips alike. The long shadows shift slowly as the sun moves, bending and stretching across the nave, and you notice how each subtle change seems to awaken a memory in the organ. A faint flicker of past notes pressed gently into the silence that surrounds you. Your hand lingers on the polished wood, tracing its curves and edges, and the air feels denser here, infused with the quiet music held within the pipes, each one a vessel of memory and sound that exists even in the absence of fingers, air, or breath. You step back, letting your gaze roam across the instrument, and sense the patient anticipation woven into every pipe and key. The organ, remembering the music of centuries, its silence, not empty but full, carrying the weight of devotion, time, and the cathedral's own quiet pulse. Even as you move away toward the center of the nave, the presence of the organ lingers, pressing softly against your senses, a gentle reminder that music can exist in memory alone, and that the cathedral sings always, even without a choir to make it audible. And sometimes, when the light is soft and the air still, you can feel the organ breathe faintly, its pipes vibrating subtly in resonance with the building, a quiet hymn of patience and remembrance, carrying the cathedral's long-held song for anyone who chooses to listen. You step lightly toward the organ at the far end of the nave, the polished wood gleaming faintly in the soft light filtering through the stained glass windows, and the air feels thicker here, as though it has absorbed the weight of countless notes never played. The smell of varnish and old wood rises subtly as you approach, mixed with the faint sweetness of dust warmed by sunlight, and you feel the coolness of stone beneath your feet grounding you while your senses reach for the quiet resonance that hangs in the air. The organ's pipes rise in perfect rows, silver and shadowed, like a forest frozen mid-breath, and you imagine the faint hum they carry even when untouched, a patient memory of music and vibration that rests quietly beneath the cathedral's vaulted ceilings. You reach out to the keys, your fingers hovering just above them, feeling the polished surface, the subtle ridges and grooves pressed into the wood, and for a moment you sense a stillness so complete it feels almost like a pulse waiting to be awakened. The air carries a delicate chill, mixed with the faint warmth of sunlight, and each inhalation brings the scent of waxed wood and old stone, a fragrance that presses softly against your senses, making the cathedral itself feel like a living, breathing presence in patient expectation. You notice the shadows of the pipes stretching across the floor, bending and lengthening in response to the shifting sun, and in the silence, it seems as though they lean slightly forward, attentive, carrying the memory of every note, every chord that has ever filled this space. The faintest vibration travels through the stone floor as you stand near the organ, subtle and nearly imperceptible, a reminder that the building itself remembers the music long after hands have left the keys and voices have faded into air. A beam of sunlight strikes one row of pipes directly, and you see the silver glint of reflection ripple softly across the stone, like a gentle sigh, as though the organ itself is exhaling quietly, holding its memory in a fragile, perfect balance between sound and silence. You rest your hand lightly on the bench, feeling the smooth wood beneath your palm and the subtle warmth of long use, and the quiet resonance of the organ seems to press faintly into your chest, a reminder that silence can carry as much weight as sound. The faint scent of candle smoke drifts from the altar, mixing with the earthy aroma of the stone, and the space around the organ hums softly in harmony with the cathedral's quiet pulse, carrying a subtle vibration that you feel more than hear, deep in your bones. Your fingers brush lightly along the keys, noticing the subtle texture of worn wood, the slight unevenness of time pressed into the surface, and it feels as if the organ has stored every touch, every chord, every sigh of music, holding it gently in patient memory. The long shadows of the vaulted ceiling bend delicately toward the organ, and you sense them gathering, wrapping around the pipes in a silent embrace, carrying with them the memory of hands that once coaxed melody from this instrument in slow, deliberate devotion. You lean closer to the tallest pipes, inhaling the faint scent of metal and wood, and feel the vibration of the building subtly beneath your fingertips, a low, imperceptible rhythm that intertwines with your own pulse, tying you to the cathedral in a quiet communion. The sunlight shifts slightly, and the shadows along the pipes dance in slow motion, subtle as breath, and you imagine the organ's memory as a living thing, its silence pregnant with sound, patient, waiting for someone to stir it into life once more. You press your cheek against the polished wood of the bench, feeling the smoothness and the gentle tremor that travels faintly from the organ through the stone. And it is as if the cathedral itself has leaned in, sharing the weight of music held for centuries. A faint draft moves through the nave, brushing the edges of the keys and pipes, and the organ responds imperceptibly, the air vibrating just enough to awaken a memory deep within. Like the faint echo of a song sung long ago, held quietly in the bones of the instrument. You take a slow step back, letting your gaze sweep along the rows of pipes, each one catching light differently, each shadow holding the weight of unplayed notes, and for a moment, it feels as though the organ is breathing along with the cathedral, exhaling centuries of quiet devotion. The faint scent of rain from outside drifts through a high window, mingling with the warmth of sun-warmed stone, and the vibration of the building carries subtly through the organ, so that even in stillness, you can feel its song echo faintly, pressed into the very air. You run your fingertips lightly along the keys once more, tracing the grooves of wear, imagining the ghostly resonance of music filling the space, the organ remembering every note, storing them in silence, like a patient archivist preserving a treasure too precious to release. The distant hum of the nave, the soft vibration of the walls, and the faint rustle of air from open windows all mingle with the organ's quiet presence, a symphony of imperceptible sound and memory, carrying the cathedral's voice in tones you feel rather than hear. You notice how the sunlight highlights the intricate carvings along the wooden frame of the organ, and the shadows bend delicately in response, making the instrument appear almost alive, as though it waits for the right moment to awaken, and yet is content to simply exist. The scent of candle wax drifts faintly again, mixing with wood and metal, and the cathedral seems to pulse gently in time with your own heartbeat, the organ's memory folded into stone, wood, and air, a song held in quiet patience for anyone willing to linger. You kneel briefly to touch the cool stone floor at the organ's base, feeling the faint vibration that travels upward through the building, and the instrument seems to hum softly in response. An invisible melody, threaded through silence, felt in your chest and fingertips alike. The long shadows shift slowly as the sun moves, bending and stretching across the nave, and you notice how each subtle change seems to awaken a memory in the organ. A faint flicker of past notes pressed gently into the silence that surrounds you. Your hand lingers on the polished wood, tracing its curves and edges, and the air feels denser here, infused with the quiet music held within the pipes, each one a vessel of memory and sound that exists even in the absence of fingers, air, or breath. You step back, letting your gaze roam across the instrument, and sense the patient anticipation woven into every pipe and key. The organ, remembering the music of centuries, its silence, not empty, but full, carrying the weight of devotion, time, and the cathedral's own quiet pulse. Even as you move away toward the center of the nave, the presence of the organ lingers, pressing softly against your senses, a gentle reminder that music can exist in memory alone, and that the cathedral sings always, even without a choir, to make it audible. And sometimes, when the light is soft and the air still, you can feel the organ breathe faintly, its pipes vibrating subtly in resonance with the building, a quiet hymn of patience and remembrance, carrying the cathedral's long-held song for anyone who chooses to listen.